Hello everyone. Today we will be examining events in Russia during the decade following 1914. As with all of your lectures, I should stress that this is meant to be a supplement to the events discussed in your textbook, and as a result, I will only be briefly covering the events of the two revolutions themselves. More important for us today is the impact of the revolution on the far-flung reaches of the Russian Empire in Europe and Asia. Few European socialists in the 19th century saw the revolution of the working class that they longed for breaking out in Russia. Marx and Engels had written that a large working class would need to be established in a country before a revolution could occur. Politically, a state would also need to undergo a so-called bourgeois, aka democratic, revolution such as the French or American Revolution, before the Workers' Revolution could take place. The Russian Empire lacked a large working class, although it was rapidly expanding, especially in southern St. Petersburg and in Moscow. But following a failed revolution in 1905, Russia was clearly far from democratic rule. The Tsar, the Emperor, was happy to keep dismissing his parliaments called Dumas until one with a loyal composition was voted upon. In 1914, the Tsar and his advisers could continue to set Russia's foreign and domestic politics however they wished. Numerous revolutionary groups disagreed with the classic Marxist perspective. Some revolutionaries said that the Russian villagers already ran themselves along socialist lines, as tools, animals, and sometimes even land was shared between the peasants. Anarchists, who were stronger in Russia than in most of Europe, noted how weak the state was in the far-flung corners of the Russian Empire, where locals ignored the directives coming out of St. Petersburg whenever they could. Lastly, Lenin and his cadre of revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, argued that the Russian Empire was weak and vulnerable precisely because it had not undergone a successful democratic revolution. Rather than wait for the revolution of the bourgeoisie, it was up to the workers to take matters into their own hands and seize control to bring about an immediate improvement in their lives. Between 1906 and 1914, the Russian Empire recovered somewhat from the shock of the 1905 revolution and increasingly strengthened its military and its economy. Massive investment poured in from France as peasants flocked to factories in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Extraction of grain in Ukraine, oil in the Caspian Sea, and metal from the Ural Mountains grew more efficient with every passing year, and the size of the Russian railway network greatly expanded. Indeed, one of the motivating factors pushing Germany into war in 1914 was fear that Russia would soon become too powerful to resist. Revolution in 1914 seemed a long way off, particularly as the immediate effect of the outbreak of war was to strengthen support for the monarchy. The Duma allowed its sessions to be suspended, and a number of voluntary organizations came into existence to lend support to the war effort. Russians were united around the cause of protecting Little Serbia from Austrian aggression. One Russian who did not offer support for the war was Lenin, in exile in Switzerland for his revolutionary activities. Lenin opposed the war from the start and called for socialists throughout Europe to take up the cause of peace, which they did not. Indeed, socialists in France and Germany seemed positively enthusiastic at the prospect of a war and voted in their parliaments to fund it. Russian armies mobilized quicker than anyone expected, and their massive defeat at Tannenberg in August 1914 at least gave France breathing room as German troops were hurriedly shifted east. A disaster for Russia came with the Ottoman declaration of war. Whilst the Russian army performed very well against the Ottoman forces in the Caucasus, the failure of the British to take Gallipoli in 1915 trapped the Russians from Western supplies, which now had to be transported through the icy ports of the north. Irregular supplies from the west meant that the Russian wartime years would be marked by massive shortages, especially of munitions and ammunition. In 1915, a German offensive destroyed the under-equipped Russian army in Poland and led to a wave of refugees fleeing eastwards. A so-called progressive bloc emerged at home, calling for Jewish emancipation and autonomy for the Poles. Tsar Nicholas mostly ignored it. Even once he had taken control of the army at the front, he continued to interfere with politics at home, firing liberal ministers and preventing the effective wartime coordination seen in the UK and in France. In 1916, Russian General Brusilov led a successful offensive into the Austrian lines, which restored Russian pride but failed to knock Austria-Hungary out of the war. The troops were now well supplied, but the situation in the Russian cities was desperate. Inflation, strikes, and food shortages were everywhere. In March 1917, as you have read, Hungary striking Russians overthrew the Tsar and power became divided between the liberal provisional government and the socialist workers' councils, known as Soviets. The vital turning point in the uprising came when Cossacks summoned to disperse the crowds refused to obey orders, and troops in the Petrograd garrison mutinied and went over to the insurgents. Most Russians either rejoiced or were indifferent to the fall of the Romanovs, whose reign in Russia had lasted 300 years. The Romanov dynasty had been unable to protect ordinary Russians from the vicissitudes of modern warfare and its stresses upon civilians. The Tsar's fall, however, left a large political vacuum at the heart of Russia. The provisional government could have corrected this by calling for elections, but the size of the country and the pressures of war meant that these elections were continuously delayed. The decision of the government to continue the war with Germany was suicidal, especially as the Germans made rapid gains and the Russian soldiers on the front lines became increasingly rebellious. Ordinary Russian peasants simply did not care about the war in the same way as the middle-class government did. They wanted land, bread, and peace, and it was the revolutionary Bolsheviks in the Soviets and the factories who promised them this. In the end, the provisional government came under the domination of Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky before falling entirely in the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks, who had avoided being wiped out due to the support they enjoyed in the poor areas of Petrograd, seized upon Kerensky's weakness and overthrew him. The Russian Empire was not yet the Soviet Union, however. What followed was 5 years of chaos and civil war. One of the first things that the Bolsheviks did was call the elections. However, when they lost these elections to the Social Revolutionary Party, supported by the peasants, the Bolsheviks had the parliament disbanded. They then signed peace with Germany, which, as we saw in the last lecture, temporarily ended the Russian presence in Central Europe. The Bolshevik negotiator Leon Trotsky had expected the negotiations to be aided by revolutions in Berlin and Vienna, which in the end never occurred. Now Lenin and his inner circle could focus on the rapidly apparent Russian Civil War, which was breaking out everywhere. The Bolsheviks' military, the Red Army, was formed in February 1918, and Trotsky became its leader. He proved to be a far greater military leader than he was a peace negotiator, building up a formidable fighting force. The Bolshevik forces, nicknamed the Reds, were opposed by the Whites, anti-communists led by former Imperial Army officers. There were also the Greens, who were revolting peasants in the countryside, and the Blacks, anarchists who fought the Reds and the Whites and were strongest in Ukraine. The Western Allies intervened on the White side and provided much war material and finance, at first to keep Russia in the war, and later due to a loathing of the Socialist Revolution. The Reds were focused in the industrial heartland at the center of Russia, whereas the Whites drew their strength from the corners of the empire far from the new capital of Moscow. Eventually, this was the key advantage in the Whites being defeated, alongside their lack of unity and their generally odious behavior to the people in their territory. During the course of the Civil War, the nationalities question in Russia became very important. Lenin was distasteful of Russian nationalism, but he nonetheless presumed that foreign communists would want to work with his Communist Party as it was the most powerful in the world. When communists in places such as Ukraine and the Caucasus Mountains either failed to combat nationalism in their countries or took power but ignored Moscow's directives, Lenin was all too willing to impose central control. In this he was perhaps encouraged by Joseph Stalin, a Georgian, who was the so-called Commissar for Nationalities. Stalin insisted that the borders of the country that in 1922 became known as the Soviet Union should be the same as those of the Russian Empire, even though the latter had been a blatantly imperialist and expansionist state. We shall now consider how civil war and the nationality question affected different parts of this former Russian Empire. In the Baltic States, German troops pushed out local communists before declaring the existence of a client state dominated by the Baltic German minority. Following Germany's surrender in November 1918, the Bolsheviks declared that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was now null and void, and the Red Army invaded the region. They were driven out of Estonia by a nationalist counteroffensive backed by the British and a volunteer force of Finns. The Estonians, free by February 1919, then invaded Latvia to the south. Latvia was a mess, torn in a three-way war between Germans, Latvians, and the Red Army. The Whites threw their support behind the Germans and looked to create one unified White/German force to march east. The Latvians, Estonians, and the British, however, worked together and threw the Germans out. In Lithuania, the Red Army took the capital Vilnius. Whilst the Communists were driven out of the rest of the country, Vilnius was lost to the Poles, who considered it to be their own city. Unstable democracies were established in all three Baltic states. Ukraine and Belarus were even more messy. Two Ukrainian governments were formed in 1917. One, the Ukrainian National Republic, was formed by Ukrainian nationalists and Democrats in Kiev, and the other, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, was formed by the Bolsheviks in Kharkiv. Ukrainian independence was declared in Kiev in January 1918, just before the city fell to the Red Army. In the following years, different parts of Ukraine switched between the control of various factions with bewildering frequency. The Ukrainians fought amongst themselves, with conservatives supported by Germany overthrowing the moderates who had promised reforms. In the west, around the city of Lviv, the Ukrainians were defeated by the Poles, who had a numerical dominance in the city that they referred to as Lvov, which became part of Poland. The Whites attacked Ukraine from their base in the Crimea in 1919, alienating everyone with the cruelty of their rule and their refusal to compromise on national questions. The Ukrainian nationalists, torn between Whites, Reds, and Poles, collapsed and went underground. Jewish Ukrainians were subject to vicious pogroms, accused of being both communists and capitalists. In the south of Ukraine, a massive anarchist uprising under Nestor Makhno dominated the countryside and defeated numerous White armies. By February 1920, the Whites had been expelled from Ukrainian territory, and the Red Army defeated Makhno and established its dominance. Ukraine would now be ruled directly from Moscow. In Belarus, an independent republic was briefly declared, but the country was soon divided up between the Soviet Union and Poland. In the Caucasus front of the First World War, the Russian army had done well and pushed the Ottomans many miles west into Anatolia. However, after the revolution, the Turkish forces formed the so-called Army of Islam and counterattacked. Baku, with its important oil field, rose in revolt, but this was put down by a strange alliance of Bolsheviks and Armenians. The Army of Islam soon took Armenia and advanced towards the city. The British sent a small contingent from India to defend Baku, making the coalition opposing the Army of Islam even weirder. Unsurprisingly, the Ottomans conquered Baku in September 1918, but were then compelled to leave due to signing peace terms with the British. An independent Azerbaijan Republic was then conquered by the Red Army alongside independent Armenia and Georgia in 1920. Full control from Moscow, was soon implemented. Lastly, we should cover events in Central Asia. Here, Muslims convoked a national congress in Kokand and established an autonomous government under Mustafa Chokayev, which was conquered in February 1918 by Red Army forces. The Basmaki revolt then broke out. A combination of Muslim traditionalists and bandits, the Basmaki were soon widespread. In the early 1920s, the revolt threatened the Soviet government with the permanent loss of much of Central Asia. But the Red Army enjoyed military superiority, greater discipline, and singleness of purpose. The Basmaki, on the other hand, were nearly as inclined to attack each other as they were to fight their common foe. Enver Pasha, the former leader of the Ottoman Empire, joined the revolt in an attempt to turn it into a pan-Turkish movement and unite all of the world's Turks into one superstate. He was killed by the Red Army in 1922, and full control over Central Asia was re-established by 1926.